What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Tidal Gardens. So I am back here with Elliot from Marine Collectors,
How's it going?
and we just wanted to do a quick top 10 list for you guys today. So we were kind of like just talking earlier about like fish that are considered like impossible.
hmm
And we wanted to dig in slightly into why that might be the perception and just like how true it is, and if there's any kind of like tips and tricks to actually attempt some of these things successfully.
Yeah.
Okay. So we made a list earlier today. The first fish on this list is the Moorish Idol. I have to say up front, I have not had a lot of personal experience with most fish on this list, but I have done three of these. So I have the tiniest bit of experience, never the Moorish Idol. What is the deal with that? Because I have heard that those are extremely challenging.
It's one of those fish that is usually associated with spontaneous random death and you don't know why. And I can almost say with absolute certainty that I think that happens with, or sorry, in direct correlation to a dietary issue, namely constipation, just because that is a fish that in the wild, it is eating sponge and really fibrous material.
Okay.
And with that comes, a very specific type of digestive tract. So when you're feeding this fish really fatty foods like just frozen shrimp or pellet food or whatever, it's not solid enough for their digestive system to actually work through. And I think that's where most of the issue comes around. Like we sent Ryan over at BRS a Moorish Idol 2 years ago, and he's like, "Dude, why did you send me this fish, man? I'm gonna kill it in front of everybody." Like, and I'm like, "Just trust me." I told him, "Make sure there's nori in the tank, or if you want, you could even feed like the Hikari algae pellets. Put it on a feeder, but just make sure it has algae every day. It'll be fine." It's 2 years later. Fish is still perfectly fine. It went in, when it was translucent juvenile, this like almost see-through fish, and now it's the size of a CD. And
For those folks out there that know what a CD is.
yeah, and it's you're perfectly happy. And it was a one minor tweak thing, like, hey, make sure this fish has a fibrous diet. It'll be fine. It's a very easy fish to get, long term.
So one random anecdote that I heard about that fish was that you can get them to eat,
hmm
but whatever it is that you're getting them to eat does not have any nutritional value for them. And I think that at the time they were trying to feed it different types of meaty foods. And that was probably where they were running into that stumbling block, was because
Maybe.
they needed all of that fibrous food instead.
I can't say that I've actually ever heard that.
Yeah,
Um,
that is one of the things that I've heard, but I think that it might have just been like people just repeating stuff like I just did.
I mean, here's the thing. I've heard plenty of times that they can't actually get the fish to eat to begin with, which is one
Mm,
of the hurdles. But I think that's more of the fish probably just doesn't come in good condition
I see. So
issue.
just tons of vegetation for them.
Yeah, because it's like sponge material. That's not something that you can just go buy at a fish store, like in a frozen flat pack or whatever, right?
Right.
Like I don't know who sells sponge, but
I think
algae's
some
a close
angel
second.
foods I think might have some.
Yeah, like there's a angelfish formula that I think Hikari makes, but there's so much other stuff in there. It's not necessarily that's all they're going to eat is the sponge material in that
Mm.
food. But, nori is a great second or any type of other algae-based food, high in fiber.
Do you know if those things eat coral?
I would say that 90% of the customers that buy them from us put them into reef tanks with no issues.
Oh, okay.
But dietarily, yeah, they'll probably pick at stuff. Now, whether or not they'll pick at stuff to the point where now that coral's dying,
Tough to say.
probably not. I hear that they are supposed to actually nip at SPS more,
Oh,
so I've been told.
that's the
Uh,
rare SPS but not LPS nipper. Okay. They exist.
but I don't know. It doesn't seem the case to me. And like everyone that I know that I've sold one to has SPS. Like the one that went into Ryan's tank, that's an SPS tank. He's got very little LPS in there. None of those colonies just got eaten.
Okay. I'm going to add like a random one to this list just because I thought of it just now.
Mhm.
What about those orange and blue filefish?
The Harlequin filefish.
Harlequin filefish. What do
Yeah.
you think of those?
I think that they're super cool. I think that they actually, in a large SPS dominated tank, are probably one of those fish that could almost exclusively live off of just eating off the live coral And if the colonies are big enough, there won't necessarily be a detriment, particularly if you only have like one or two in a tank full of
Hmm.
acros.
One of my friends locally here has like a very large SPS tank,
Mm-hmm.
and at one time he had like a pair of them,
Yeah.
and they would nip at the coral polyps, and he'd basically have no acropora polyp extension, but he had so much acropora that
Yeah.
they could just like nip for years. I think that he had them for like 5 6 years.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good run with them too.
But you know what? He was able to get them to eat pellets.
Yeah. So they are incredibly trainable. They will take to clam, they will take to mastic, they will take to frozen foods eventually. Like a lot of times, what you can do with that particular fish is take like a piece of staghorn.
Mm-hmm.
Thinner branch stuff usually works a little bit better. So, like if you happen to have a frag of it that didn't make it, you keep the skeleton. Uh, Smash the mastic on there, just put it in there. They'll pick at it. Then eventually you can mix some ices into the mastic. They'll start eating it, noting like, okay, that's the taste and the smell of that food.
Mm.
Eventually they'll just take the frozen, and then you can wean them onto other stuff that's actually floating in the water
Yeah,
column.
that's interesting because it's a very cool fish.
Yeah,
With I guess like somewhat challenging dietary
yeah.
requirements.
I mean, in the wild, it's an obligate corallivore. That's all it eats is living coral tissue.
Yeah, and it does eat that in his aquarium. It was just one of those things where you're just like, you know what, I'm just gonna accept it.
Yeah,
I think he eventually lost both of them, but it was like years,
yeah.
like 6 years or
But
so
see,
to
if you
lose them
have
both.
them in the right environment, tons of coral, I mean, that's what they do in the wild. They don't just wipe out a colony of coral and kill everything, right?
They just nibble here and there
Yeah.
and everywhere. Yep.
Yep.
Next up on the list, we have the ribbon eels. So when we were making this list, I was like, ribbon eel. And Elliot's like, they're hard. And I'm like, I'm pretty sure that nobody has had a good time with these things.
Yeah. So it's a delicate fish, but I don't see them as being overly difficult.
Okay, so the challenge that I've always heard, and the reason why I've always been dissuaded from ever even attempting one,
Sure.
is that it's again, I think that you're gonna hear a recurring theme. It's about feeding.
Yeah.
And like these fish seem to be like extremely not great at finding and eating food,
Yeah.
even when you put the thing in front of its face.
Yep.
Like,
That's very much the case.
okay,
Um,
so how is that not challenging?
ah, I don't know. I mean, the things that I personally find challenging are fish that like have such specific needs that it almost makes it impossible just because the level of effort that you have to put into the fish. But like for the ribbon eel, turn the lights off, turn the flow off, make sure that you drop one krill right in front of it. That way it can follow the scent with the flow off. To me, that doesn't sound that difficult, but
And just you just saying that though,
no.
I've never thought to try that as a feeding method.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're trying to get a fish that's like that, that is maybe doesn't gravitate to prepared foods immediately, I think there's always going to be a break-in period where you have to kind of train the fish because it's not necessarily always going to have it be in the wild where there's going to be a singular krill sitting on the sand right in front of its burrow and it knows to eat that every day type of thing. But fish do learn and eventually, okay, well, every day I get fed at this time. It smells like this. It's going to be around here.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that
And you,
doesn't seem difficult to me.
and
But
so you feed it krill. That's the other
yeah,
thing.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so
So
like fresh krill.
yeah, like Krill Pacifica, I think is the type, frozen
Okay,
flat pack, but they usually take to it pretty readily. Like I'm
okay,
actually quarantining one for a customer right now, and it eats just fine.
huh.
Now, granted, maybe it's a supply chain issue thing, and I just happen to be lucky that maybe the ones that we're getting are actually from a really good supply chain, but I do maybe 5 of them a year, and I can't say I've ever lost one.
This is me going off of a lot of like what I've heard,
Yeah, of course.
but they really do seem like an incapable fish of finding and eating food. They look really dumb. Like
If
like why are you so dumb and you what do you eat? What gets caught by you in the wild?
Yeah, I
Sort
was
of
gonna
thing.
say, well, it has to eat something. There has to be some way to get it to eat because it exists in the wild, right? It's consuming something.
Yeah. Do you ever see them eating fish?
I don't have any personal experience with them in my own personal tanks, like in my collection. So I don't know. But
I'm wondering if it's one of those things where like, oh, we're just going to be out at night and we'll just eat a sleeping damsel in a rock someplace. Like that's its thing, or
it could be.
I don't know.
Now that I think about it, the majority of the people that probably order those are definitely the type of clientele that have a tank dedicated just for that fish.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it's necessarily in a community mixed reef with a ton of different stuff, but just the way that their mouth structure is and the way it's designed, I don't think that they would eat a ton of fish, particularly ones that might be strong enough to just, fight off and swim away.
Gotcha.
So,
Huh. Okay.
I
So
would imagine that things like peppermint shrimp and sexy shrimp and the smaller crustaceans would be more at risk.
that is one of those like signature fish that I always wanted to try when I was like back in college.
Um,
Always got talked out of it. I didn't know anybody that was successful with it. So yeah,
well,
that's
maybe I'll send you one and you can give
yeah.
it a
Let's
go.
not do that. Let's not do that. There might be some degree of neglect that happens here. Next up, this is a fish that I actually do have currently in my collection. My collection. It's an employee. It is a leopard wrasse.
Yeah. So leopard wrasses often get a bad rap for not eating or they don't ship well, which both are true.
That's been my experience. Is they don't ship well. They're like dead within like a couple of days
Yeah.
of receipt.
No, it's definitely true that those two things are definitely aspects of those fish, but they are connected. If you have leopard wrasse that, let's say, is stressed from shipping and it's been moved around a ton, regardless of it being a leopard wrasse, most fish that are stressed out from being moved around aren't going to eat right away.
Mm-hmm.
Like other fish like copper bands or other sensitive fish that are known for not eating, it's usually has nothing to do with that fish not wanting to eat the prepared foods you're feeding it, but the fact that it's not recovered from whatever traumatic experience or physical trauma or shipping trauma that it incurred.
I guess it's particularly sensitive then, more
Yeah.
so than other
So,
wrasses.
like, what we do with leopard wrasses at marine collectors is we bring them in, we let them sit in methylene blue for a couple days. We make sure that they have sand so they can bury, make sure that they feel comfortable, make sure that they're as recovered as possible before they actually go into the systems. When they go into the systems, then I have a system that's dedicated to just leopard wrasses. It's unmedicated when they first go in. We'll get them eating. As soon as they start eating, then we'll jump them into meds, and then we can kind of continue the protocol from there. But that like initial break-in period is super important.
In our talks on the other podcasts and stuff like that, I think that methylene blue is one of those things that at the very least we're going to start with just upon intake. And hopefully we'll have designed a better quarantine intake to actually do some treatment here. But that for me, the biggest struggle is that initial receipt of these animals.
That is when most of the fish usually incur some form of damage. It's during the acclimation process after you take the fish out of the bag.
Yeah. Real quick about taking the fish out of the bag.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to immediately mix in like an ammonia blocker as soon as you open the bag?
So depends where you're
I've
getting the
heard
fish.
some things about this particular problem.
So it depends where you're getting the fish. Like if you get them from us, we pack with an ammonia blocker so you can open the bag and you don't have to worry about the pH shift and ammonia toxicity and all that fun stuff. But assuming you get the fish from a wholesaler, more than likely there's going to be some form of copper in that water or other medication, just because most of those wholesale facilities, they run a subtherapeutic level of copper in there just to keep parasites suppressed. And most of the time, if you add an ammonia blocker, like for example, Prime is like the most available one for everybody, right? It's C-Chem Prime for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. But if you mix that with copper, depending on what kind of copper, it could be really bad. Depending on the acclimation.
So many depends, man.
Well, so here's the thing. If let's just say that the goal is to get that fish out of the bag and into clean water in the safest way possible. Regardless of the contents of the water, the best way to do it is actually to just put a little pinhole into the bag and put your drip line directly into the bag without opening it, because it'll slowly change out the water while still keeping that enclosed like buildup of CO2 in there. The pH won't shift as much, but you can still change out the water in that process.
Interesting.
It's an enormous pain in the ass, especially if you have like 40 bags.
Uh-huh.
But that is one way to do it.
Okay.
Now, most wholesalers or most facilities where they're receiving fish, or even from us when we're getting fish directly, the practice is to open up the bags into an acclimation container of some sort, and then you mix your water with their water. Usually what we'll do is, if let's say we're getting some fish that are been in transit for a prolonged period of time, is I'll suck out some water with a syringe out of one of the bags. What's the pH? And then I'll buffer the acclimation water. We have a dedicated reservoir down to whatever the level is with a CO2 canister.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can just open them all up, not worry about the pH changing, and change all the water, and then slowly mix in the normal water that's at a normal pH, and then the ammonia's gone. Then we can put an ammonia blocker, methylene blue, and we can start treating the fish in that manner.
Gotcha. So that was a little bit of a departure off our fishes. But it's important because it's like this is one of those tricky fish, and you see like the lengths that kind of have to be done on intake of some of these animals. It's like this is why they're on the impossible list, you guys. It's hard.
Here's the thing: is that anytime that we do leopard wrasses at marine collectors, I have to do them all at the same time. Like if I'm going to do a run of leopard wrasses, I dedicate an entire system to just leopard wrasse and another anapsis, just because I can treat them all the same. We can, ramp up the medication in that system altogether or whatever, but I can't just throw them into our generic quarantine systems with other fish at already a therapeutic level. It's too much for them, and then it'll usually overwhelm them.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. It sounds like a mess.
Yeah, definitely.
Because a lot of other like fish importers that I've talked to said basically, yeah, leopard wrasses are probably something that we don't really try to order a lot of ever. But you probably should be left well enough alone. Many people don't do this right.
Yeah.
And in my experience of just ordering it from wholesalers, like they don't do that well. So we've had a couple here that have like survived and done well, but a lot of like new ones that we try to bring in, it just doesn't work out.
Yeah.
And we clearly don't do nearly enough to try to give them the best chance. So, that's a lot. It's a lot to try to do.
Yeah.
At least that, there is something to try. Like there is that room for improvement, I guess.
The cool thing about marine collectors is that I have it's an extension of my own personal obsession, right? And I have the ability to play with fish in a manner that most facilities can't, just because it's not cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in a unique situation where I have that ability, and
you can be a little bit extra.
Yeah, exactly.
It is nice to have that leeway.
The reason that we charge so much for those, impossible fish that we have under our signature fish section is because we go through an exorbitant amount of extra effort and labor, and
it's not that easy.
This fish came from the other side of the globe to here, and then it's super delicate, and it needs to be treated a certain way. We should do that.
Yeah, and I guess like a quick little blurb about when it comes to pricing. There's well, not necessarily even specific about marine collectors, but
sure.
Let's say that I can order fish wholesale. It is X.
Yeah.
I could buy that fish locally at an LFS for 3X.
Yeah.
Sometimes that 3X fish is just a better deal because I can't save money on dead fish. Sometimes it might take 5 fish coming from a wholesaler for how to have one survive. Yeah. And in that process, you've killed 4 fish, you've traumatized your staff here, and it's an awful experience for everybody involved. You should have just bought it locally at retail, and it would have been better.
Yeah.
And the difference between a retail fish versus a wholesale fish, those are 2 different products. There's a lot of just the fact that retailer has had that in their system for 1 week makes a big difference, and it didn't have to ship for you to go get it.
Yep.
So anyway, that was my little soapbox thing. Speaking of boxes, next on this list is boxfish.
Yeah, so these are cool fish, and I enjoy them because they do have a little bit of a danger aspect to them. They can secrete toxin that'll totally wipe out an entire tank. So whenever we bring them in, we keep them totally by themselves, and they also don't tolerate copper, so they need more specialized quarantine. But they can be a tricky fish because their bodies are rigid, and you can't actually tell if the fish is skinny or not. The only fleshy part of their body that you can really see, well in terms of body mass is their tail that actually, is separate from their actual rigid main part of their body. But like boxfish they don't ship well. It's a danger to all the other animals, which may or may not be a good choice to add to most aquariums. But if you're like me and you like a challenge, then they're cool fish. For quarantine and feeding, which are usually the biggest issues, quarantine is usually going to be comprised of like chloroquine phosphate. They're really tolerant of it. I've even done it up to 0.08, which is the higher end of the therapeutic range, and they handle it just fine. A lot of times they won't eat prepared foods right away.
So what do
Fresh
they typically eat?
fresh frozen clams, they take to them almost immediately.
Okay.
Like we just did some ornate boxfish, which are actually a cold water species of them, and like we had them eating on the acclimation tables just because I wanted to see, like, let's throw this in there to see, because people tell me they're difficult. Ate right away. It's like,
Like fresh clams.
yeah, check that out. That's super cool. So
Do they eat anything else? Like when you try to like wean them off of like
yeah,
that
so
and into
they'll
something
take the
else?
mysis and normal foods pretty quickly. I've had them eat nori. I've had them eat mysis. I've had them take to mastic, pellets.
Okay. So,
Um,
but it's this on intake, they can just like stop eating.
it's more about initially getting them to eat. I think that it just might be a difficult fish that's awkward in a captive environment.
Mm.
Like they don't have great depth perception, and they tend to bang themselves up on the walls of the aquariums,
Mm.
and they don't ship very well. So like all of these obstacles make for a fish that probably isn't comfortable and ready to eat. But once you can make them comfortable,
The cost of not getting them to eat is they could potentially bomb your entire system.
yeah,
Okay, cool.
yep, yep.
It kind of reminds me of an invert that sometimes you see in reef aquariums called a sea
Mhm.
apple.
I love sea apples.
Sea apples are really cool,
Yeah.
but they do have that grenade effect too if things go wrong.
Is that with all sea cucumbers, or that's just sea
More
apples?
so with sea apples. I think that there's some toxicity with a lot of different types of cucumbers,
Sure.
but that one in particular is like the world ender.
The Australian ones that are like blue and red.
Hmm.
Yeah, those are my favorite. Those are pretty
I
cool.
think they're one of the coolest looking animals.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
yeah.
and from what I understand, they're not difficult to care for, but when they go, they go.
Aren't they like a NPS coral? You just feed them particulate food?
I don't even know if you have to try that hard. I think they
Oh,
just
really?
filter feed. Yeah,
Okay. It's
yeah,
just a matter of if they die or not, or walk into a
yeah,
pump.
yeah. Next on this list, we have, I guess, a category of fish
Hmm.
that they are the obligate corallivores, and in particular, butterfly fish, because that's usually what people are talking about when they're
Yeah.
talking about.
This is one category of fish that I will say that I have yet to master. And I'm currently working on it just because I really like ornate butterflies. And I don't necessarily think that the fish themselves are going to be that tricky, because I've gotten them to eat before. They eat pellets, they eat frozen, they eat everything. It's more of getting them in proper condition, because the reality is that it's a very cheap, cost-effective fish, which means it's probably not handled very well, unfortunately.
Mm. And is that a
And
function of the geography that they're coming from?
um, no, I mean maybe it is, but not that I've noticed in particular. Like I've got them out of the Philippines, I've got them out of Fiji, and like I'm talking in respect to ornate butterflies in particular, and there wasn't really a big difference in terms of the quality of the fish when they came in, but it's definitely a fish that I haven't quite figured out yet. But I know that they're not impossible, just because I know that I've trained several to eat prepared foods, when that's like this fish will never eat prepared foods ever type of fish.
Hmm.
Um, I think it's a matter of circumstance. Like usually they don't come in great volume either. It's like one here, one there. That was like a bycatch type of fish that came through,
I see.
because I don't think divers are often targeting that specific species.
Gotcha. And you don't accidentally net catch a fish usually.
When you got a barrier net and you just
Oh,
scare everything into it.
then maybe so. Yeah. If you're out there with a little 4-inch net,
Oh yeah,
less so.
probably not.
Yeah. Is that also another one of those fish that you could try to train kind of like the filefish,
Yeah,
where you kind of disguise a coral
yeah,
in a mastic
absolutely.
paste?
So usually they'll actually take the clams immediately in my experience. But the masticon, like a staghorn branch, works great. If they still won't take to anything, like a piece of feeder acro, we'll call it.
I'll just feed a coral.
Yeah, just feed it coral. It'll eat it. And eventually you can, once it's nibbled away the live tissue, just replace where the live tissue was with some mastic. They'll take to it eventually.
The stickheads in the audience are like, I can't believe this. Unsubscribe.
You know, that coral that you don't really like that grows too fast, like green slimer or something, maybe. It's just, that you're going to throw away anyways. Sure.
That is kind of funny because I think that the overlap of butterfly lovers and coral lovers, that's a really thin sliver on that Venn diagram. I'm just gonna go ahead and throw that out there.
Yeah. Well, there's a Facebook group called like Corallivore Challenge or something. I forget the name, but anyways, there's a couple people on there that have like full blown out SPS tanks, and they put these butterflies in there, and I'm just like, all right, pushing the limits, love it. That's super cool.
It's like you didn't really want to sell all those home wreckers and Walt Disney for $300 an inch. No, you wanted butterflies. You're about that life. Okay, I respect that.
Yeah, just living life on the edge.
Very predictable one, in fact.
Yeah.
Next on this list, the Achilles Tang.
Yeah.
So this is the one where I get to be like, they're that hard. Again, because it's like I don't have a ton of experience with them. I've really only had like a couple, maybe a handful. Okay.
Yeah.
Never once have really had any issue with keeping them.
Yeah. Yeah, Than has a really nice Achilles downstairs.
He's been like saying like how much?
Yeah, like
How
I was
much?
like, I'll buy that from you. It'll live in my Hawaii tank for the rest of its life. Like you should sell that to me. No, you know what? For the majority of people, I would say that it's not a fish that anyone should be buying. I think that it is a fish for 1% of fish keepers. And the reality is that to recreate the environment that fish naturally inhabits in the wild, it is impossible to do it in a captive environment. Like I was showing you some videos before of like Achilles in Hawaii, and like they'll be over here and then a swell will come and all of a sudden they'll be 40 feet over there in like that much time. There's no way to recreate that type of flow, but that's the type of environment that they're in all the time. And it's a fish that needs a ton of exercise. It's a fish that needs a ton of really, really densely oxygenated water. And it's a fish that needs a lot of fiber and a lot of algae in its diet. A lot of times, like you see really fat football type Achilles in tanks where they've been there forever. And I'm like, that fish is not even remotely healthy.
It's like it's great that it's has eaten.
Yeah, and it's alive and it hasn't died from ick yet, but
it has diabetes.
Yeah.
It's like that is a super fat, unhealthy, overweight fish.
Yeah, and it's a fish that needs to move around a lot to be healthy. Like it needs a lot of space, like 8-foot tank minimum, and if you have ever had ick in the system, I would say that more than likely or not, it's a when the Achilles is going to succumb to that infection, not if. The amount of times that I hear of people being like, yeah, I really want to buy an Achilles, and they'll call in and they're talking to me about it, and I always have to tell them, like, don't buy that fish. It's not going to make it. Like, you're relying on a UV when you know that you have an active ick outbreak or an ick population. That fish is just going to become a breeding ground for that parasite, and you're never going to overcome it. It's just the reality of that specific fish.
I'm not above just saying that, you know what? Luck happens occasionally.
Yeah.
I could have just gotten lucky a handful of times.
They've
been model citizens in my tank. They're not a bit aggressive, which is very, very unlikely for, that variety of
that type of Acantharus.
Yeah, because like the powder blues are like homicidal maniacs. And then you have like this Achilles that it's just a dream. It ignores all the other fish.
So what I will say is that even though powder blues are like the same body shape, same genus, they're substantially more likely to be managed in terms of if you have an active ick population, and they can be managed with UV because they're a lot more robust than Achilles are in general. But yeah, they can definitely be assholes.
Yeah. I was given one for free and I cannot give it back. That's why I have it.
Well, it's very fat and I've seen it and it's very healthy. So
It's mean.
Yeah.
Okay, so Achilles Tangs probably not in the future.
Yeah. I mean, I have a very in-depth love and hate with that fish. Like that is the fish that got me into quarantine and was the seed fish for how I kind of got into the world of quarantine and marine collectors. Like that's the reason it's our logo, you know. And it's not a fish I recommend to most people. Like if you want to keep that fish, a lot of flow, a lot of good water quality, zero parasites ever. That means quarantining corals, invertebrates, anything wet in a fishless system for 11 weeks, 10 feet away. Like you have to be super diehard about this.
Or lucky.
Or
Or
lucky.
never
Dan is very
forget
lucky with his
lucky.
one downstairs.
Right?
But for most people, the other 99 that he's taking away from, don't do it.
It's like, like, sell this to me. And I'm like, I really like to keep it. It could be dead in like 2 days after he leaves. I'll be like, oh, I messed up. Oh, I messed up bad. I should have sold it to him. I'm claiming no expertise into the success of that fish.
Yeah, it is a really nice specimen. It has like the perfect teardrop too. So, it's a very good looking fish.
Next up on the list, I didn't even think these things were legal, but the Weedy Sea Dragons.
Yeah, so I didn't know that they were either. One of our suppliers local to us was like, "Hey, we have some captive bred Weedy Sea Dragons coming in. Do you want them?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah."
Absolutely.
Like I
Am I
was
gonna go to jail though?
yeah, and like I guess they need certain permits or something, but the weedy variety I don't think is the one that's endangered or threatened. It's the leafy one.
Leafy,
Yeah,
yeah, which are
that's
the really big ones.
yeah.
Yeah.
Wheaties actually get really big as well. But anyways, these came in, and needless to say that I definitely had a sort of rare occurrence of impulsivity with that particular purchase. But luckily for me, I do have a lot of friends that work at public aquariums and they have a lot of experience with those fish. And I was able to put together everything I needed to before those fish actually came into the country. And oh my God, they're so cool. Like, it's been a long time since I've been excited about a fish.
It's a type of fish that is very, very uncommon in the
Mm-hmm.
home aquarium.
Yeah.
Fairly common in public aquariums.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen them a lot there.
Yeah.
Um, is it the challenge of the Weedy Sea Dragon
Yeah.
that's kind of attracting you to it?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So they're captive bred, and they're like, oh yeah, they're eating frozen mysis, and they are incredibly hardy. And I was like, awesome. We'll keep them in their own system. Nothing else will touch them. Bought a chiller, stays at 62 degrees, like dedicated just for this fish. And then we ordered some live mysids, and I made sure that I had a constant supply of them. And you know what? It's captive bred. It's not that difficult to keep. It's got a couple care requirements that I never would have thought of. Like apparently they like to gulp air a ton, and once they do, it's kind of game over. So deep tanks are better. And if the tank isn't deep enough, a layer of like plastic or styrofoam or something on the surface, just so they can't actually come up and gulp air. But apparently they're also really, really highly susceptible to things like uranema. That's like the main issue that those fish have. And I don't know, maybe I just got lucky or whatever. It's captive bred. It came super solid. And yeah.
So
It's
how long
just
have you had it now?
month and a half, 2 months.
Okay.
Yeah, and they're very, very recent acquisition.
Gotcha. Oh, very
But
cool.
I'll tell you, it's been a long time since I've been excited about a fish. So
It's interesting to me the sorts of things that get people excited in the industry that have done it for a very long time. Because oftentimes, like the sort of corals that gets people excited here aren't necessarily like the brightest and most rainbowy of corals.
yeah,
It'll just be something weird. And Jake Adams was like that. Like the sort of the corals that in his collection that he was the most proud of
yeah.
were actually rare corals, and they're just gray, like that sort of thing, right? But it is genuinely rare.
So here's the thing is, yeah, I'm definitely in that club of like, I want all the stuff that you only see in books, and I want to master those things. Like the Dr. Seuss is one of like my favorite fish, and I think that I'm probably one of the like most knowledgeable people on that fish now. Like I've got thousands and thousands of hours of just observing their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
But I've gotten to the point where I now have multiple breeding pairs and they spawn regularly. And like that was
Oh,
never
okay.
a thing that like even people who have had multiple of them before, like spawning's never been recorded in captivity before.
Was that also considered a very challenging fish, or was that one of those that are just expensive and
It's
unattainable?
I would say that there's a couple obstacles. Usually they come in with lip rub, which once they have it, I haven't found that it usually reverses. Usually it's just like slow infection. It eats away
Oh.
at the jaw. Even with really strong antibiotics, it just doesn't heal properly. The other issue is like recurring buoyancy issues because it is a really deep water fish.
Hmm.
And usually it'll be linked to like a dietary thing and a bad culture in the gut that's producing too much gas that's overfilling their swim bladder. But outside of that, once if they don't have those two things, they're really solid fish.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah,
Like a
curious.
small grouper.
Well, I've only seen them in like in pictures and in video, and yeah, I don't know anything about them. But since you brought it up, I was like, should they be on this list?
No, they're pretty easy to keep fish.
I think that this one was under debate slightly as far as like whether it's a difficult fish or not.
Hmm.
But tilefish,
The argument could be made that those are a difficult fish.
are they an impossible fish though?
No,
No.
no.
What are the problems that people have with them?
I've heard that they don't quarantine well. I've heard that they don't eat or they come with spine issues or they come with other physical traumas. Granted, I've heard these things. I've never routinely seen like, yeah, that's always a chronic issue with that species of
Hmm.
fish.
I just heard they'd like to jump a lot.
They do like to jump a lot. If there is a small hole or crack in the lid, they will find it for sure.
Yeah, I heard that, and they can smash their heads on like Euro braces and other types
Hmm.
of lids. I've heard that they're extremely skittish and that can like throw off their feeding as well as making them jump more, things like that.
Yep.
But I guess they're not the challenge that some of these others on the list are, I guess.
Personally, I think they're pretty easy fish.
Okay.
But
Are they also like deep water?
yeah, they're a little bit deeper. I wouldn't call them Twilight Zone fish, but they're probably in like the 60 to 100-foot range most commonly.
So
Yeah.
not even entirely out of the reef at all.
No, they're usually on like a sandy bottom. Like they'll build a rubble pile that they'll make a burrow out of.
That just kind of reminds me. A lot of fish that are kind of like the bottom dwellers, they
Hmm.
tend to be the best jumpers. Like the orange spot I
Shrimp
think
goby.
I think it's just the orange spot goby, the one that does all the sand
Oh, the
sifting.
diamond gobies. Yep.
Diamond goby,
Hmm.
yeah. I love those things when I had tanks of substrate. Number one jumper though. Otherwise, just an amazing fish to have. Like you could train them to eat out of a turkey baster.
Hmm.
They kept everything clean.
Yeah, good rule of thumb. If it's long and skinny, it's a good jumper.
You know, the next most likely jumper for us has been not the mandarin, but it's like the ruby
The dragonette.
dragonettes.
Yeah.
They're one of the only
Hmm.
fish that have jumped out of the tanks downstairs. Those tanks downstairs have like 8-inch Euro braces. And that little tiny scooter,
He came up into the middle and was like, "Yep, that's about the right angle." Just
they all jumped.
oh, really? It wasn't
It
just like
wasn't
one.
one. They all jumped. You know
I'm
how
sorry, that's not
impossible that
funny.
is? They also jumped into overflow boxes and then ended up in the sump and then jumped out of the sump. It's
Did you have multiples per tank?
no.
Oh, mm. Yeah,
What
that's
an
weird.
incredibly athletic fish that you would never assume.
I know, and like you have wrasses in every tank. Like those don't jump.
We tend to keep wrasses that stay in the tank. Like the yellow choruses, those are the jumpers.
Okay,
And so we stopped with that.
I gotcha. Like the possum wrasse and the melanaris, usually
Oh,
not.
never, almost never. Occasionally Melanaris, but like the Melanarises that would jump are jumping out of a tub that has like this much gap of like water line to edge of tub, and they can just go.
Yeah.
So okay, yeah, you're asking. I'm asking for it, but even then, rare. Okay, so tilefish, mid, impossible at best. The next one on this list, I think, is a consensus Hall of Fame impossible fish. That would be the purple queen Anthias.
Yeah. Um, Purple queens are cool. I like them.
Okay,
I do,
well, why are they considered impossible though?
they usually don't eat frozen foods or any kind of prepared food. Usually they'll need to eat live baby brine shrimp, like the newly hatched, the super, super tiny stuff. But the reality is that that's probably a fish that's left best in the ocean. Like public aquariums or people like myself who are willing to go the extra like 40 steps to make sure that fish gets all the way through quarantine and established and conditioned properly. Most wholesalers, local fish stores are not going to go to that extent. The purple queen Anthias is a fish that it's constantly eating throughout the day, and you need to get it as close to the supply chain as possible or as close to the collection point as possible. Like if that fish got collected on Monday, you want to have it by like Friday.
The longer it stays in like the hands of collectors and wholesalers,
Yep.
it's like
You're just,
you're burning valuable time.
yep.
Yeah.
And like for us, I only get them from one supplier. And funny enough, it's a fish that I wouldn't necessarily suspect to be coming high quality from this particular place, but they do purple queens very well. We get them in, we put them into these really large round vats, big group of them at a time, and we feed them baby brine, live baby brine. Then once they've kind of developed a relatively noticeable feeding response in terms of we put food in there and they readily come up, eat all the live stuff, then we'll start freezing, or sorry, not freezing. We'll start killing baby brine, feeding them the dead stuff. And when they start taking the dead stuff, then we can move them to like Calanus. And once they're on frozen Calanus, then usually that's at the point where we would sell them and say, hey, this fish needs to eat this food just because the rest of the conditioning process is going to take about 6 to 8 weeks, and we can't keep them in therapeutic levels of medication for that long. But at least now they're on a prepared food that is store bought. You can go get that thing, just thaw it out, 5, 6, 7 times a day,
Mm-hmm.
do a little bit of this. Eventually, you can get them onto larger particle food sizes, and then you can get them onto pellets. And then they become pretty easy to keep because then you can put, a auto feeder and the whatever duration that it's on. Every fish should get a few pellets at a time, 12 times a day. It's very easy. But getting them to that point is like 12 weeks of time, like 40 steps later. And that's assuming you got the fish as close to collection as possible.
And I'm assuming there's like significant losses along the way.
Actually, no.
Not so much.
If I get a good shipment of them and they were collected almost immediately and shipped out, I lose maybe like 1 or 2 out of a group of 30.
That is much less than I would have thought.
Like, here's the thing, that same principle and protocol that I do for purple queens also works on Avansi and Ventralis and all the other Anthias that are like really difficult and need to be fed 100 times a day.
Yeah, Anthias in general, I think that you see them in like people's tanks a lot on Instagram and stuff like that. And I think that the thought process is like, oh, they're just expensive, not necessarily that they're that different than any other fish, but in reality, it's like the care requirements of that fish is kind of nuts.
No, it definitely is. And I don't necessarily enjoy doing them, but I enjoy the challenge of the fish just because that's what attracts me to doing particular fish is I enjoy things that are incredibly challenging and I like figuring them out. Like that's my entire draw to the hobby and to my obsession with fish. But I think that fish is probably better left in the ocean because who is going to know what to do with those fish and also execute on doing all those things? I think it's a very, very finite number of people.
Yeah. It's like if you just happen to see one at your LFS that's like a single one that's kind of tucked into a rock, it's like probably want to just go ahead and avoid that one.
Yeah. Like
The very first one I've ever seen at an LFS was exactly that. That's personal experience. I did not buy it, but it was like, yeah, that ain't gonna do so well.
well, I don't know. I mean, everything that we do at Marine Collectors is very much specialized, and I don't sell stuff for the intention of what's most profitable. Like people that call in and ask me all the time, hey, what fish do I buy? They're more a coral person. They just want some fish for utility. Like, tell me what to buy. I'm like, dude, you're the one that's taking care of the fish. You're gonna need to want to look at it every day. Like, I'm not gonna tell you what to buy. Like, that's not something I ever do. I think that that is a fish that should totally be left in the ocean. But if I know that like this particular customer is very, very well versed in fish, and I know that they're gonna execute very well on keeping that particular fish, then sure, I'm willing to do it because I know that they're gonna be well cared for. But like 99% of people are not that person.
Okay, an actual legitimate
No,
impossible fish. Okay.
it's yeah.
Okay.
Don't buy Purple Queen Anthias.
It's not for you.
It's not for you.
So this next one is kind of a surprise, but green chromis on the impossible fish list.
Okay, so I'm gonna just go on a record. I hate green chromis. I think those fish should be left in the ocean and nobody should keep them.
This is funny. Before Elliot landed here, I was like, I'm looking for a school of about 24 green
And I was like,
chromis.
here's how you're gonna do that. You can do that by yourself.
Yeah, I was like, don't you do this stuff?
No.
It was like this procedure, and I'm like, that's a lot. That's a lot. And so to make it onto this list, what is the deal with green chromis?
So green chromis,
Because everybody's seen them at their
yeah.
LFS. They're super common, super cheap.
I get requests to do green chromis all the time. And anybody who's bought fish from me knows that we have a base fee for quarantining fish and it's $150. Even at $150 a fish,
Like per fish, per green
per
chromis.
green chromis, I refuse to do them. Like if you ask me, I will never sell you a green chromis. Like when BRS wanted to do the green chromis tank, I was like, oh my God, why would you do that to me? We're going to have to set up a dedicated system just for these. And like, no, like the reason we don't bring chromis into the warehouse is because they are just carriers and breeding grounds for Uranema. Like I've personally unpacked boxes of green chromis and they put like 1,000 per box. Like that's not a fish that's necessarily treated well, which makes sense. Like of course they're the ones carrying all the disease because they're the most susceptible. Because when you're buying them, they're like, a penny a fish, and then after the freight, they're 50 cents, and then wholesale, they're a couple dollars, and then, but it's not a fish that I believe should be brought in just because of the way that they're treated and how many of them are going to end up dying from urinema and
Because
infection.
once they're in captivity and stable, nobody would say that a green chromis is remotely challenging.
No, it's not a challenging fish. It's
But
not at
they
all.
probably just don't see like the
I
freak show of before it gets to a sellable state in a local fish store.
Not even that, but like just think about how many of those chromis are actually going to live long term. Like let's just say that hypothetically you got a school of 10 green chromis. They didn't carry any uranema. They got into your tank. Those 10 green chromis are probably going to pick each other off until you have about 2.
Is it that bad?
Yeah.
I don't remember them being quite so difficult, I guess. But maybe
I
I'm
mean,
reminiscing about the 90s and it wasn't really like that.
I can't tell you how many people who have told me like, yeah, I really want to get some more green chromis. Like I had a really nice group of them. Like over the years, like they kind of just picked each other off, and like now I only have 2. But I had like 20 of them when I first started, and I was like, yeah, that happens a lot. If you're just bringing fish in and keeping fish and maintaining fish for the purposes of replacing them constantly, it's probably not a fish that should be kept. But
That's so wild. I really didn't know that they were quite like that. I hear that type of behavior with certain Anthias
mhm.
where like they form these giant harems, giant meaning like the tiny harems that we purchase. And there's like this pecking order of aggression, and like the lowest ranking female usually is the runt, eventually gets killed. The next weakest one, that becomes the runt, gets the abuse from all the ones higher
um,
on the hierarchy.
a perfect environment for a green chromis is like wall to wall acropora, staghorn, tons of territory. And then you're also going to feed a ton of food. And then maybe you also put like a predator fish in there to keep them distracted so that they're not focused so much on themselves. Once they're comfortable and they're damsels like any other fish, they can be aggressive towards each other. But I don't know. The sheer volume that I see of green chromis coming in and the amount that conceivably are going to be alive, I think that it's just like a
So it's both the early stage import business of them, collection and import of them.
yeah.
And then once you finally get the survivors, They try to kill each other eventually.
Yeah, I tell people this all the time. Like, I know you want green chromis. I know you're willing to spend the money on them to get them from me. But how upset are you gonna be when you just spent like $1,000 on a small group of chromis and you have like two?
By the way, the entire idea of $150 green chromises is like
Like, I
the
think it's
type.
outrageous.
It sounds outrageous because when I first came into this hobby, they were literally $2, $3,
Oh yeah,
five for seven.
yeah.
It was something like that. It
No,
was
and I completely
crazy.
agree. Like the people who ask for them, I'm telling them like, dude, for 150 bucks, you could go and buy 50 of them from your local fish store. Like, why on earth would you buy them from me? Like, oh, we really want you to quarantine. I'm like, I don't want to do it.
I don't want these in my building. I want nothing
Yeah,
to do
I
with these
want
animals.
nothing to do with these animals. I feel bad about it too, because like you bring in so many of them and you know that they're just like doomed, you know?
Surprised to see them on the list because I was like, I could use a school of green chromis, and you're like,
How about like a school of like long spine cardinals? Because those usually don't pick each other off and you can keep them in big groups. One of the few cardinal species that like doesn't routinely pick each other off.
because my bang guys and stuff
Yeah,
do.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That does it for our top 10 list with a couple of extras thrown in there of impossible impossible corals, impossible fish, how legit that is, and some tips and tricks on how to keep those guys alive. Thanks again, Elliot,
Yeah,
for coming and
of
hanging out
course.
with
Thanks for
us.
having me.
And hope you guys learned a little bit of something. And we'll see you guys next time. Happy reefing.